The Anatomy of Quiet. Chapter 1. The House That Listens. I arrived at the house at the slowest hour of afternoon, when the sun has tired of its own performance and leans on rooftops like a bored patron at the back of the theater. The taxi pulled away with a dribble of dust, and the street returned to its old hush. It wasn't the hush of peace. It sounded more like a held breath, like a room waiting for a verdict. I stood with my keys in my palm, the metal teeth pressing crescents into my skin, and studied the address my mother had left me, the address of a house I did not remember and a childhood no one would vouch for. The facade was the color of paper left under glass for too many summers, a brownish tea-stained hue that made the window frames look like eyelids. 3 stories, too narrow to breathe properly, with a single tamarind tree leaning conspiratorially into the second-floor balcony. This was District 3, where the narrow lanes still believed in gossip, where laundry became flags, where the lanes knew your stride. I had spent 12 adult years unlearning the lanes of Saigon and foreign cities with glass elevators and clean elevators that smelled like lemon. But the body remembers. The humidity held me like an old ant. The air felt unlaundered. The keys offered more resistance than they should, as if the lock had been taught to recognize a different wrist. When the door finally cracked open, the house exhaled, releasing air that smelled faintly of camphor and something I would later recognize as ink. I crossed the threshold feeling as though I were entering a photograph made of fibers instead of pixels, grainy, fragile, touched by the hands of time. The first step onto the tiles sounded like a sentence that had been waiting years to begin. "Hello?" I called out. I don't know why I expected an answer. Perhaps I believed memory could be summoned like a dog. Silence. And then something that wasn't silence, an undersound, a low, continuous murmur, like the collective throat-clearing of a courteous audience. It came from the walls not as speech, exactly, but as the intention of speech. I stood very still and listened the way one listens to a seashell pressed to the ear, knowing it's not the sea but wanting to be seduced anyway. The foyer was narrow, choked with shoes, none of which were mine. On the left, a glass front cabinet displayed porcelain swans and cups with cracks repaired in gold, the kind of repair that believes a fracture can be a decoration if you're stubborn enough. On the right, a framed newspaper clipping hung crookedly, the headline sun faded into illegibility. Above the staircase, a portrait. A woman with a tired mouth and an iron jaw. I had her jaw. Everyone had always said so. Mother's will had been as spare as an empty bowl. The house goes to her. She will know what to do with it. I did not know what to do with it. When I'd told my colleagues at the clinic that I needed time away, I described grief as a practical project, a folder to reorganize. They nodded in the brittle way academics do when confronted with life. The truth was less tidy. Grief felt like moving into a house whose rooms had been rearranged by a courteous but slightly malicious ghost. You knew your things were still in there, but the doors were all different. I set my suitcase in the foyer and stepped into the front room. It had that ghostly neatness of a place rarely used, coasters arranged like punctuation on the table, a lacquered cabinet with a television wrapped in plastic as if to keep it from modernity. The curtains were heavy, their brocade pattern the same dark green as hospitals in old movies. In the corner, a tall metronome sat on a piano, its pendulum arrested at the midpoint, mid-swing, mid-thought, mid-heartbeat. I touched it, and it began to tick, then tock, then tick. Under its rhythm, the house's murmur adjusted itself, or perhaps my hearing did, and for a second the two sounds braided together in a thick rope of time. On the low table lay a notebook, not one of mine. The cover was bound in a brown that had pretensions toward leather. It was not unfamiliar. It made my fingertips press down harder than necessary, as if anxious to leave a fingerprint. I opened to the first page, Patient S. Date, symptom. A language that does not yet exist, spoken fluently by the walls. I read the sentence again and felt the oddest sensation, simultaneous recognition and rejection, like seeing your own face from a bad angle. Beneath the line, a sketch, a rectangle labeled Room of Murmurs. Not the living room, not the stairwell, but a room tucked behind the kitchen where the floor plan suggested there ought to be a pantry. In the drawing, the walls were marked with small hatchings, as if furred. I closed the notebook gently, the way you might close the eyes of a body. Perhaps the notebook had been left as a courtesy, a guiding thread through this little labyrinth, or perhaps the house was planning a joke. I knew a good deal about jokes houses like to play. My dissertation had been on architectures of grief and the performativity of hauntings in urban domesticity. I could say those words aloud like a spell and feel a version of myself. Dr. Linh Nguyen, specialist in trauma communication, appear like a paper doll, well articulated, with easy instructions for how to fold her. I carried the notebook to the kitchen, the way a priest might carry a relic. The kitchen's tiles rose to mid-wall, pale blue with a tiny lotus stamped at intervals so regular it could make a person go quietly insane. Faucets gleamed from disuse. A refrigerator like a pale tomb stood unplugged with its door ajar. Inside sat a jar of preserved plums in dark syrup that had cured into a little planet. I set the notebook on the counter and pushed at the far wall where the sketch suggested a door might be, but the wall held. Its paint was slightly darker than the rest, and in places hairline fractures traced themselves from baseboard to ceiling, fine as spider silk. I pressed my ear to the wall, the way one eavesdrops on neighbors in hotels. The murmur sharpened, a forest of small voices rustling. I could not catch a word. They were not words, but the cadence was familiar. In the clinic, patients sometimes spoke like this, the unsorted sound that came before language when trauma drags communication back to its larval stage. I had learned to listen to cadence, to pauses, to the exact length of silence between a word and its accidental twin. I had learned to count a person's quiets instead of their syllables, to index the kinds of quiet as if they were birds, the panic quiet, the bargain quiet, the defiant quiet, the wound quiet, the prayer quiet. I knocked on the wall with the knuckles I reserved for doors opening onto other people's pain. "Is anyone there?" I asked, half smiling at the theater of it. A breath rose from the floorboards behind me. Or maybe a draft made a trick of the curtains. I turned quickly, and only the kitchen looked back. Sink, lotus tiles, a small bowl of dog food turning to stone on the windowsill. The bowl made me ache in a manner for which I don't have verbs. The last animal my mother had kept was a songbird that had screeched hymns until the neighbors complained. My mother had given it away with a shrug. I had always wondered if the bird missed us, or if freedom is sometimes quiet enough to be mistaken for loss. I left the kitchen and climbed the stairs. Each step announced me with a small wooden confession. On the landing, I paused to examine the portrait of the tired-mouthed woman with my jaw. It had hung too high to meet a child's eye, but an adult can carry a ladder of hindsight. Her hair was pinned back in a severe knot. She held her hands folded in her lap, as if reticent to show them. The paint was cracked at the throat, a hairline fissure from collarbone to chin, like a scar on a map. "How did you arrange it?" I asked her quietly. "Who gave you permission to make me forget?" The portrait remained polite. "All around me," the house murmured. The bedroom doors opened without resistance. The first revealed a room as carefully impersonal as a hotel sheet. A bed made and never slept in, a shelf of books shrink-wrapped in plastic, a small crucifix too high to bless anyone. The second room smelled like hair oil. A vanity stood with an oval mirror, its surface blind with dust. I wrote my name across it with a fingertip. Lynch. It looked like a child's idea of possession. If I could inscribe myself on things, maybe they would keep me. A third door stuck. I put my shoulder against it until my weight found the angle the old wood wanted. The room beyond was less tidy. Boxes stacked against the walls like barricades. A narrow bed with a quilt as severe as an accountant's ledger. On the floor, a carpet that once had been red but had aged into a color like dried hibiscus. I set down my bag and sat on the bed, which answered with a complaint, and allowed myself the first full inhale since the taxi. I had been away for 12 years. I have a trick for measuring long absences. I count the number of jokes that have gone stale. In that room, 12 years of jokes were fossilized in the air. Jokes about cracked tiles, about landlords who microaggressed in 2 languages, about slippers that remembered the shape of feet, about the good tea being kept behind the bad tea on the shelf, because hospitality is a performance, and we should never use up our props. My mother had been good at that, saving the good for good and the bad for us. She must have saved this house for something. For me, the idea that I was the good made me want to apologize to the walls for the mistake. Evening settled with its old choreography. The neighbors testing their karaoke microphones, the distant rattle of a vendor's cart, the call and response of alley cats, a scooter's whine rising like an argument and falling like the end of one. Light seeped through the slats of the shutters and laid algebra on the floor. I unpacked the 2 books I had brought. The habits of an academic are portable, unfortunately, and arranged them on the nightstand as if they could protect me against the house's soft conspiracy. Downstairs, my name rang once, crystalline, and I would have dismissed it as a memory, except the ring had the precise timbre of the doorbell, a childish ring, a 1-note toy bell, like the first polite knock of someone too small to be certain of their welcome. I went down the stairs and opened the door and found no one there. The street, empty, with the particular emptiness of houses eating their own light. The tamarind shadows swayed and made a suggestion about companionship. A child's chalk drawing had been scuffed across the pavement, something that began as a hopscotch grid and mutated into a labyrinth, the boxes proceeding in an odd mathematical bloom, more spiral than ladder. In the far square, someone had written in purple chalk, "SPARROW." "Hello?" I said again, to the street this time. The air did not deny me. On the threshold lay a small envelope, not white, but the yellow that letters resigned to waiting become. There was no stamp. On the front, in a drawling hand, "To Lynn, who hears in lowercase, I dislike magic when it uses my name. But the thing about being a doctor of minds is that, most magic is just a well-trained ordinary." I picked up the envelope, closed the door, and sat on the bottom stair. The paper rasped against my skin in a way I did not like. Inside, a single page of notebook paper, torn cleanly, like a separation done with a ruler. The writing was neat, with that slight rightward lean that means the writer wants to hurry, politely. "Dear Lynn, Every house grows its own grammar. This one learned how to conjugate apology. If you stand in the kitchen and press your ear to the wall, you'll hear the tense shift from present to past to subjunctive. I think it's asking you, which version of yourself would you like to use, and which one would you like to forget? P.S. The pantry isn't a pantry, but you'll see. Sparrow. I sniffed the paper, involuntarily, the way we smelled childhood books, the faintest trace of tobacco. The handwriting was familiar, not because I recognized it, but because it belonged to a category of writing that has always known how to talk to me. The confident apology. I slid the paper back into its envelope and went to the kitchen. I pressed my ear to the pantry wall and counted between breaths to slow my heart. The murmur rose, as if delighted to have an audience. It was untranslatable, but not without meaning, the way a cat's conversation with the window means what it means without needing our alphabet. I set my palm flat against the wall, feeling for temperature, and felt instead a place where the paint was smoother, unnaturally so, as if someone had varnished it, and under that, a seam. I ran my fingers along it. At shoulder height, a notch hid itself. Not precisely hidden. Rather, it behaved like something well-mannered. It did not impose itself. It waited to be recognized. I pressed the notch. A click, satisfying and obscene. The seam loosened. The panel slid inward, the way a throat opens at the right persuasion. Behind the wall, a corridor no wider than my shoulders, with a string of bare bulbs that hummed like insects. The smell was ink and dust and something else, the dry smell of paper lives. I stepped inside. The panel side closed behind me with the whisper of a confidant accepting a secret. The corridor leaned slightly to the left, just enough to disturb the balance of walking. Space doesn't have to be wrong in order to be cruel. It only has to be almost right. I placed my palm to the wall and shuffled forward until the corridor opened into a room whose geometry made my stomach hesitate. 4 walls, a ceiling, a floor. Ordinary, but the ordinary had been calibrated to undermine. The floor sloped by degrees too gentle for a photograph. The ceiling pressed lower at one end than the other, like a thought that didn't quite reach. Books, thousands of them, on shelves and tables and on the floor, making canyons through which a very careful child could pass and pretend to be an ant. The books were unlabeled, their spines wrapped in the same tea-stained brown, titles hand-lettered in a small script. Not the Day We Thought, A Door is a Verb, Curriculum of Fog, Inventory of Apologies. I picked one at random and opened it. Inside, a transcript not of conversations, but of the spaces around them. A list of pauses arranged by length. 10 seconds, 4 seconds, the part where she pretended she hadn't heard, the part where he wished she had. A second list recorded the temperature where each pause had occurred. The result looked like a prayer written by a scientist. I read a page and felt a kind of vertigo I usually only get when looking at my own clinical notes after midnight. On a table at the center of the room sat a metronome twin to the one on the piano upstairs. It was already ticking, as if I had wound it months ago and walked out and never returned. There was a chair, too. Only one, with its back to a wall that had been painted. No, not painted. Penciled, pencil upon pencil, the graphite built up until it shone like cheap satin. Words wove over and under each other. The letters were small, the size recommended for secrets. I leaned close and read, "Today we will not name it. Today we will only count it. If we give it language, it will make a house. If we give it a house, it will outlive us." So, I said softly. To the room. You're the throat and the stomach. As if it resented my anatomy lesson, the room's lights flickered, a small petulance. I sat in the chair and took out my phone, the way people do when confronted with old pain. I tried to invent a screen to stand between me and it. No signal found me. My reflection in the black phone screen was the face of the woman in the portrait upstairs, minus the jury-weathered mouth. The jaw was the same, the eyes, mine, and yet slighted by something I had not been there for. How long did you keep this? I asked the pencil wall, knowing the pronouns were sloppy. Who had kept what from whom? There are diagrams for this, but diagrams are just politenesses. Good manners when presented to an autopsy. There was a desk tucked into the corner, metal legs like the skeleton of a patient bird. Drawers, 3 of them, each labeled with more of those soothing little words: notice, narrate, refuse. The refuse drawer held the case files, organized by a system that would have made my mentor proud, the kind of order that imagines it can outwit subjectivity. Patients, identified by single letters, then by objects, as if their initials needed a second name to keep them from running away. Patient. S divided by object, sparrow. The name walked up my spine. I opened the folder and found another handwriting altogether, block letters, as if the writer distrusted curves. It was a record of not trauma, exactly. Something like trauma's twin, the kind who borrows its dresses but refuses its shoes. S reports a house where the walls retain the temperature of words. S remarks that apologies, when spoken, cause a measurable draft. S requests that no photographs be taken. Says photographs are conversations that never learn how to stop. Hey, Sel Dunday. I turned a page, and there I was, as neat as you like. S mentions a child named Lynn. S says the child was good at listening to the wrong things. It is one thing to be told you were a difficult child, another to find yourself annotated as a symptom. My first impulse was to close the folder and put it back in the drawer and go upstairs and buy vegetables and cook an omelet, as if cholesterol could glue a person back together. Instead, I sat very still and listened, not to the recorded past in my hands, but to the present, the tiny present of the ticking metronome, and the present behind that present, the murmur of the walls, and behind that, the even smaller present of my own breath negotiating with my ribs. Years ago, a patient named M had said, "All I want is a story that ends." Not a happy ending, necessarily, just an ending that knows how to walk to the door. At the time, I'd written something sympathetic in my notes about closure and narrative competence. Now, in the room of murmurs, I realized I had been afraid of endings my whole life. I had never allowed sentences to leave me, preferring to keep them on leashes. A story couldn't leave if it never learned to heal. A sound at the mouth of the corridor, the sliding panel opening as gently as a sigh. I stood up, folder in hand, and watched the panel as one might watch a curtain when expecting a magician to come through it with someone else's watch. "Hello?" I said, meaning, "Show me your evidence." It was not a magician. It was a child, 7, perhaps 8, small enough that her sandals looked like something a doll would wear. She held a piece of chalk between 2 fingers, the way old men hold cigarettes. She had the attentive face of someone who has been deputized by the adult world and intends to perform well. "You shouldn't be in here," she said, and yet her voice had the careful courtesy of an invitation. I felt the automatic apology rise to my mouth like a reflex, and decided not to teach it to speak. "Neither should you," I said. gentling my tone around the words as one might wrap glass in cloth. "What is this place?" "The school," she said, as if I were very slow. "Where you learned." "Learned what?" "To listen to the wrong things." We regarded each other, both of us pleased enough by the symmetry of the exchange to hide our unease. She came further into the room and looked at the books with the indulgent fondness of someone who knows their bad habits intimately. "Who are you?" I asked. She drew a hopscotch square on the floor with her chalk and wrote "SPARROW" in the top box. "You left me a letter," I said. She shrugged with one shoulder, a gesture I recognized so well I had to hold on to the back of the chair. I had used that same shrug to dismiss report cards, compliments, and diagnoses, to declare myself uncapturable by other people's paperwork. "You've been gone," she observed, an accusation disguised as meteorology. "The house tried to keep rhythm without you. It can't." "Is the house sick?" I asked, surprised by my own choice of word. "Is a mouth sick when it refuses to swallow?" She hopped from square to square, obeying rules I could not see. "You and the house made a deal. You don't remember because remembering was not part of the deal." "You see, what did we trade?" I asked softly, because softness has a way of coaxing accuracy out of harsh truths. "The names of some things for the silence of others." She pointed with the chalk at the penciled wall. "Look, you wrote this for when you came back." I approached the graphite wall at the seam between two sentences, where the shine dulled and the pencil had been pressed harder. A small flap of paper had been pasted into the text with rice glue so thin it was almost invisible. The child tugged at one corner, and it peeled away with the reluctant rubbery sound of healed skin recalling an old wound. Behind the flap, not pencil, but paint, old paint, older than the penciled text, older than the books. Slowly, over years, someone had covered the wall with writing, their writing, and then they had hidden a piece of it under the writing like a prayer under a floorboard. The paint depicted a tamarind tree bending into a balcony, and in the balcony a woman, my mother, holding a baby, and on the baby's wrist a bracelet of red thread. It was not the artistry that stopped my breath. It was the precision of the wrist, the softness of the baby's hand. I had a photograph of that hand. In the photograph, the red thread is blurred by motion because babies move with a speed that insists on present tense. Here, the painted thread was steady as a rule. I put my fingers on the paint and felt coolness as intimate as a forehead kiss. "You're mistaken," I said carefully to the child, attempting a lie made of plausible vowels. "I didn't write this." "You wrote it when you were still good at hearing," she said, hopping out of her chalk grid and onto the bare slant of the room. "Before you understood which silences were useful." I laughed, because that is what I do when language becomes a hall full of mirrors. "Useful to whom?" "To the house," she said. "To the people who needed you to be empty in the right places." In my profession, we learn not to interrogate children down to the bone. Their truths are often narrow bridges suspended above ravines they cannot name. But the child was not distressed. She was reporting. My training shivered and reassembled. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, a sentence I try very hard not to say in rooms that contain my family. She touched the metronome with the back of her finger, accepting its tick as one might accept an old friend's irritating habit as the price of love. "Inventory," she said. "You have to count the rooms again, the real rooms and the other kind." "The other kind?" She looked at me as if I'd asked whether hands are useful, doors that open into sentences, windows that remember a face. stairs that go up and forget to go down. The kind of rooms this house makes when no one's looking. How many are there? She made the smallest of smiles. Enough. Her sandals squeaked as she crossed to the door. She slipped into the corridor without a sound and left dust in the air that looked like handwriting. But only if I squinted. I followed her into the corridor and found it empty. The panel to the kitchen slid open with its patient sigh. I stepped into the ordinary, or the version of ordinary, the kitchen consented to provide, and the panel sealed itself again, erasing its seam like a magician who respects his audience. I stood by the sink and ran water for the sake of the sound. Night had completed its takeover outside, and the glass panes had turned themselves into mirrors, giving the kitchen a performance of itself. I caught my reflection and touched the line of my jaw in the glass, the bone my mother had given me, the bone the portrait had worn like an oath. Inventory. Very well. I could inventory. You do not survive academia without learning how to count. I took the notebook from the low table in the front room and brought it to the kitchen counter, where the light was less insulted by the house's mood. On the first page, beneath the line about the language spoken by walls, I wrote, Day 1. I will count only what speaks before it is asked. I will not give names to any quiet that begs for them. I will count each room twice, once by its furniture, once by its insistence. I dated the page without thinking and, in dating it, felt the room lean very gently toward me, as if pleased by my obedience to the calendar. I drew a small rectangle for the kitchen and labeled it with what the room carried that could speak: kettle, metronome, echo, tiles, cold bowl on the windowsill. Then, on the second drawing, I labeled the insistences: apology seam, draft created by certain words, door that behaves like a throat. Underneath, I wrote, faintly, because the house made me shy. I am afraid of what I will recognize. Sometimes the simple act of confessing to paper becomes a small architecture that can hold a day upright. I felt the tiniest rebalancing of the floor, or perhaps only the tiniest rebalancing of the body that felt it. Above me, the tired-mouthed portrait kept her decorum. Beyond the shutters, a motorbike's whine declaimed a monologue to an unappreciative audience. The night made its display case of the windows. The doorbell rang again. That single toy note. This time, I did not hope for a child. I opened the door onto the laneway and saw a woman who might have been my age if you listened only to her posture and not to her hair, which had the swiftness of pupils. She wore a white shirt with the sleeves folded carefully to the same length and a pair of black trousers that obliged themselves to her kneecaps. Her mouth was tired. She had my jaw. Lynn, she said. The house made a sound that was nearly human and would have been cruel to translate as welcome. Aunt, I said, my voice choosing a shape without my permission, and the word carved a corridor back in time the way rain carves gullies. I had forgotten her, but my vocal cords had apparently been keeping a separate archive. So, she said, you came. Your mother was certain you would. She was. I could not keep the astonishment out, the insult, or the relief. You can deliver a child into silence for years and still predict her, apparently. The aunt, what was her name? I could not conjure it. I put a blank where it should go, stepped into the foyer with the ownership of someone who trusts the furniture not to betray her weight. The house, she said, looking around with neither disdain nor admiration, has been patient. How long have you known about the room? I began, not yet ready to say its notebook name, too ready to give it one. The room you were always in? She said, and in the mirror of the window I saw my mouth perform the same humorless little smile as hers, since before you were able to lie in full sentences. Buy it. I indicated the kitchen with an open palm, a woman's calculated hospitality. She declined with a small shake of her head. I don't come to drink, she said. I've come to return something that belongs to you. She held up a key ring I had not noticed in her right hand. It had only one key on it, old-fashioned, with a long stem and a teeth pattern like a jagged skyline. Its metal was not clean. Its metal looked like something that had been in a person's mouth. I took it, and it was heavier than the architecture should account for. What does it open? I asked, though I knew. The house knew. The notebook knew the question was only a formality, the kind adults use to cushion children from the hard edges of an answer. The upstairs closet, she said, and her mouth, my mouth, thinned into duty. Behind the coats, you must not go alone. Must not? I raised my eyebrow in the gesture that had frightened interns and soothed donors. My aunt did not take the bait of theater because the house will remember you more than you can bear, she said simply. And then she was already backing toward the door, the way people leave sick rooms after delivering their portion of medicine. Come tomorrow morning. Light is more obedient then. Come where? I asked, feeling the child in me, the one who could not see the whole hopscotch grid because chalk had a way of giving out at the most narrative moments. She named a temple 3 lanes over, a small place with a bell that believed in severity. Bring what you find, she said, and bring the book with the brown cover. You've seen it? It used to be my handwriting, she said, before yours became better at mimicry. Good night, Lynn. She left without allowing me a proper farewell, because proper farewells have a way of starting conversations that neither party has time for. The door closed on her decisively. Outside, someone had begun tracing a new chalk pattern over the old one, the squares erasing their predecessor with a polite sufficiency. The word sparrow remained in the far box, unbothered by the geometry that sought to encompass it. Upstairs, the second-floor hallway was cooler, a narrow mercifulness. The closet was at the end, large enough to house the neighbors' grievances. Coats hung there, my mother's, my aunt's, and a few that might have belonged to those who visited often enough to deserve their own hooks. I pushed them aside and found, behind the sagging wool, a small door, painted to match the wall, one of those domestic tricks that pretend secrets are simply efficiencies. The key fit the lock with a certainty that made my stomach do that thing where it reaches for your tongue. I turned it. The door opened onto darkness and the smell of talc. I reached inside with a hand that had not yet received permission from the rest of me and found a chain. I pulled and a single bulb bloomed, a flower too intent on its duty to worry about beauty. The room was small, barely an alcove, and yet it contained a trunk the size of an apology, a lacquered green that had once been the pride of some family, with brass corners gone the color of burnt bread. On the lid, under a film of dust that gave the false impression of gentleness, someone had carved a word with a key, the way children carve their certainty into desks. Lynn. I sat back on my heels because the body sometimes knows when to lower itself before the mind can announce propriety. The lid lifted with less reluctance than I'd hoped, and inside lay a curated museum of a child I did not remember. Red thread bracelet, a ribbon stiff with old sweat, a cloth rabbit with one glass eye, a stack of drawings on newsprint, a composition book whose cover had been decorated with silver star stickers in an arrangement that might have been a constellation if I had known the right mythology. I took out the drawings. Crayons had been used with the conviction of small hands. Crayons give sentences to those who do not yet like words. Houses in chalkbox geometry, trees that resembled fireworks, faces represented by coins and stripes. In the corner of each page, the child had printed SPARROW. The composition book fought me a little, the way old glue resents the opening of older narratives. Inside, the first page had been written on by two people. The top half, in a neat adult hand. If you do not remember, it does not mean it did not happen. If you remember too well, it does not mean you are faithful. Memory is a choice of verbs. Below, in a child's large, insistent letters, the house is Elsteining. I laughed again, and the laughter was an animal rattling its cage. The child me had been trying to spell listening, the way someone tries to catch a fish with their hands. At the bottom of the page, a smaller note in blue ink. Plan. Teach her to hear what will not hurt her. Plan. The house must learn to keep a kind silence. Plan. She will leave when the verbs are obedient. I closed the book. The room leaned again unless it was only the tilt of my body adjusting its understandings. Outside, a motorcycle startled a dog into a loud evaluation of mortality. Inside, I held a bracelet, a rabbit, a book, and my own name carved into wood. A person can be rewritten several times in the same font. I turned off the bulb and left the closet open, the way you leave a sick dog's cage open so it can choose when to receive your hand. In the bedroom, I laid the objects on the bedspread, with the care of a museum intern with a polite fear of provenance. Then, more out of muscle memory than decision, I took out my recorder. I carry it because the students at the clinic complain that their teachers teach in aphorisms and not in techniques. I pressed the red circle and spoke as if I were a witness. Day 1. Linh Win. The house at the subject presents with familiar, unfamiliar. The walls speak an idiom I recognize as the grammar of apology. The house contains a library that appears to archive the unspoken. Witnessed a child with my mouth and someone else's small patience, identifying herself as Sparrow. Interaction brief but precise. Assignment received. Inventory of rooms, tangible and insistent. Found a trunk labeled with my name containing materials. Effect, variable, not yet catastrophic. I stopped the recording because the word catastrophic makes a room pay attention in ways that do not serve furniture or people. I set the recorder on the nightstand. The metronome's tick had followed me upstairs. It replaced the city's outside hum the way a memory replaces a fact. I lay back on the bed and watched the ceiling perform its slow geometry. Stories hid in the corners. In the way paint finds an edge and decides to become a sentence. Tomorrow I would go to the temple with the key and the book and the trunk's contents arranged like offerings. I would meet my aunt in the kind of light that scolds shadows. I would learn new verbs for remembering that did not involve violence. For now, the house listened to me, listening to it. The quiet between us lengthened, but not in the panic way. In the way that builds a bridge between two banks that have been arguing about whether the other side deserves water. Good night, I said, softly. To the metronome, to the walls, to the child who had left chalk on the lane, to the woman with my jaw in the portrait, to the piece of myself that had chosen amnesia in order to pay for a kind of survival. The house murmured back a long sentence in the language that does not yet exist, a sentence I almost recognized, a sentence that, if translated, might have meant, "You have returned," or "We are not finished counting." I slept, and in my sleep the rooms rearranged themselves into a hopscotch that required a different body to play it. In the square farthest from the door, someone had written the smallest word of all, in letters so thin they were almost chalk dust. Stay. Chapter 2. The Grammar of Returning. Morning arrived with the purposeful mercy of a nurse. Curtains parted themselves. Corners remembered to be corners. The city cleared its throat and agreed to be a city again. I woke with the impression of chalk on my feet, as if, in sleep, I had walked the hopscotch the house kept drawing across my life. The metronome on the dresser continued its industry, precise, without cruelty. I stopped it, not because rhythm is an enemy, but because some days require a human tempo. There is a way the first morning of grief mimics a first morning at sea. Nothing is wrong yet if you are still on your back. I lay there and allowed the ceiling its modest performance of light, and when I stood, I did so with the careful economy of a person who knows the day is already full of language. Inventory, Sparrow had said, and the ant had said, bring what you find. I recorded the kitchen's insistences in the notebook, apology seam, draft when the word sorry crosses a throat, the way the tiles made a polite chorus of lotus if you let your eyes stop arguing with them. The front room. Lacquer cabinet remembers a woman correcting a child's posture by rearranging porcelain, plastic-wrapped television, a performance of ignorance. Piano with captive metronome tick interrupts grief like a spoon on a glass. I added, portrait jaw inheritance, crack at throat, the way the stair confessed with each footstep, the ashtray that held no ash, but did hold a shape of absence that remembered smoke. Upstairs, the closet with the trunk, with my name carved by a certainty that could not yet spell, the bracelet of red thread, the rabbit with one eye that had learned how to listen, the composition book that documented plans as if plans were a religion. I turned the objects in my hands like vowels. Everything wanted to be a sentence in the language of the house. I wanted to refuse conjugation and simply sit with nouns. The chalk pattern outside had changed in the night. Some squares were wider, accommodating a stride that had learned to hesitate less. SPARROW remained in the far square as if waiting were a profession. The temple waited 3 lanes over, a place whose bells spoke with the stern affection of a teacher who has learned to love children by refusing to flatter them. I wrapped the red thread around my wrist with the practical superstition of a woman who has read studies about trauma and still knows some protections prefer to be unquantified. I placed the brown notebook and the composition book into a cloth bag and tucked the rabbit in as a witness rather than an offering. I locked the door, felt the key's weight as an older grandma, and stepped into the lane, which greeted me by not tripping me. My aunt was already at the temple, sitting on the stone bench beneath the Bodhi tree that had agreed to be small in order to be adoptable by this city. She wore the same white shirt, a new pair of black trousers, and a face that performed fatigue with the discipline of someone whose sleep had never been an argument, only an accommodation. "You brought them," she said. "Not a question, the way a judge doesn't ask whether you've read the law." I placed the bag between us on the bench like a child between 2 slightly estranged parents. "The house asked me to count," I said, "because it is best to offer people your madness as a thesis rather than an anecdote." "The house has always been an accountant," she said blandly, as if offering a biscuit. "You just think it's poetry because you left." "I left because," I began, and stopped. Memory is a street that becomes a cul-de-sac without signaling. "Why did I leave?" I asked, surprising the question in my mouth as one surprises an old photograph in a book you thought you'd never owned. My aunt did not perform surprise. Because your mother and I taught the house to keep your nouns, and the verbs we taught you were the leaving kind. What does that mean? I asked, and not unkindly. Anger, when it arrives, always wants to be the main character. I have learned to cast it as a helpful but secondary witness. She touched the bag lightly, fingertips respectful of its small congregation. We had a problem that required engineering. We solved it as women usually solve such problems, with architecture, lies, and a schedule. She glanced toward the temple, where a woman was instructing a child in the exact posture with which to bow at the bell. Your mother's husband arrived in the evenings as weather sometimes does nothing you could argue with, only brace for. He was not always a storm, but he trained the furniture to flinch. We did not have the right nouns. We had no legal nouns. We had some neighbors who lent us their eyes, but not their witness. So we decided to teach the house a function. The room, I said. It was not a guess. The chalk had been willing to be explicit. Yes, she nodded. Not from triumph, but from the politeness of a person moving chess pieces no one else sees. We built a room that would keep the unspoken, and we trained you to listen in such a way that the sounds would go there instead of into your bones. The room, call it the library, the pantry, the throat of the house. The school absorbed what would have broken things we needed not to break. You used me, I said. This was not a knife. It was the fact of a table's edge. We used what you were good at, she corrected, and her face did a thing then that I remembered. Without remembering, the mouth tightened in an apology that refuses to be named apology because the word would produce a draft. And we were always careful with drafts. You listened to the wrong things, she said, echoing the file in the refuse drawer. We taught the listening to go somewhere useful. We taught it to walk into a room and lie down in books. We did not know a child's vocabulary for ethics, and so we borrowed the adult one and hoped it would translate. You taught me to forget. The words felt heavier than their size. We taught you to leave verbs in the room, she said, so that when you left the house you could carry fewer tremors. You did leave. That means the plan worked. And now? I asked. Why ask me back? The house has grown fat with sentences. Her mouth shaped the word with a distaste reserved for sins of abundance. It is making rooms without supervision. Your mother died, and the architecture became sentimental. Sentimentality is the enemy of plans. It is also the enemy of endings. The bell rang and softened our edges. A boy in 2 clean shoes looked at it as idiots look at gods, with an honesty that makes adults want to lie for the sake of ritual. My aunt's eyes followed the boy's glance, and then returned to me as if the bell had gently shaken a page to find its next paragraph. You must finish the inventory, she said. Then we will open the wall at the seam that drafts when someone says the wrong sorry, and we will teach the house a final verb. What verb? Permit, she said simply. We must teach it how to permit time to become past without becoming a god. We sat in the shade. A woman offered us lotus tea in paper cups, and we accepted because to refuse would invite a conversation about refusal. My aunt held her cup in both hands, as if tea were a small living thing that preferred warmth. The rabbit remained in the bag, but its one glass eye made its presence felt the way a polite child does from inside a closet, waiting for adults to stop pretending their lives were not already on fire. Was Sparrow my mother? I asked, tasting the question with the caution I reserve for words that have a sneaky tendency to become spring-loaded. Yes, she said. Then sometimes. She grimaced at her own imprecision. She called herself that when she allowed herself to be small enough to ask for gentleness. I called her that when I needed her to remember gentleness existed. You wrote it on your drawings because you were listening to us, listen to each other, and misapplied the pronoun. Children are pronoun anarchists. It worked for a while. We all wore Sparrow and took turns being fragile. And patient S? I asked, remembering the file where S said the child named Lynn listened to the wrong things. Your mother, she said. My notes. She tapped the brown notebook. Then you wore my handwriting and continued the catalog when we were tired. You kept records of our silences, I said, not accusing, merely narrating, because sometimes narration is the most merciful violence. We did, she said. We thought if we could weigh it, it would be less. We were right enough to go to sleep some nights. I wanted to ask a question that had the word forgiveness in it and did not. The bell would not have allowed it. Forgiveness is a ceremony I distrust, unless the bell insists. Even then, it is often theater with good acoustics. Instead, I asked a question with the word instruction in it. How do I finish the inventory? I said. What does finished look like? Finished looks like the metronome agreeing to stop without your permission, she said, and the house producing fewer rooms than the day demands. It looks like the chalk word in the far square deciding it does not have to command you. In Dudori, the chalk says stay, I said quietly, surprised that this, among all nouns, tasted like ash. She nodded. It kept you alive to want to, so we let it keep the word. Now we make a new one. She stood, smoothed her trousers with an absent hand, and picked up the bag. Let us do the part that requires light, she said. We will ask the temple to loan us some honesty. The lanes made space for us without the need for choreography. Back at the house, the door remembered us, the way some doors do, not happily, but accurately. My aunt walked into the kitchen with the patience of someone unharmed by being wrong in rooms. She placed the brown notebook on the counter and pressed her palm to the seam. The draft rose. Good morning, she said, and the seam fanned itself almost flirtatiously. Do I press the notch? I asked. No, she said. Let the house offer. We're done forcing. If it refuses to be generous, then we will name the refusal and ask again later, heavier. We waited with the passivity that masquerades as faith. The seam shivered, then warmed under my aunt's palm, as if an organism had agreed to be seen by a scientist. The panel unlatched itself with the sigh of a cupboard relieved to be useful. We stepped into the corridor. The bulbs hummed in the frequency that insects use when reciting legal documents. In the room, the shelves had shifted, not in arrangement, but in confession. Labels had become less coy. What I had read yesterday as inventory of apologies now read, in a smaller subtitle that someone, perhaps me, had added in pencil, times we should have asked for more. The table with the twin metronome ticked in a slower time, as if someone had imposed a nap. My aunt did not sit. She handled the books as a person handles a family's heirloom cutlery schedule, with respect for past meals and embarrassment at how much of life requires silver. She drew a circle on the dusty table with her finger, clearing room for language. We will count, she said. We will not understand everything we count. I can count, I said. Numbers are intolerant of improvisation. That is why they are so comforting and so insufficient. We began with the room's furniture inventory. Chair, table, lamp, metronome, shelves, a cup with stray pencils whose erasers had been eaten for comfort by a child's mouth. That mouth, my mouth. We wrote these down, then counted the room's insistences. Slope that suggests apology, noted by both. Light that flickers at words that want verbs they were denied mine. Draft that favors the word forgive only when preceded by you rather than I. My aunt's perfect eyebrows lifted at this, then nodded. The penciled wall offered its graphite sheen like an old scar invited to be weather. This, my aunt said, indicating the wall, is yours. You wrote most of it after you left. When you returned for days at a time, you do not remember. You copied your notes here because paper can be burned by people, but walls can only be burned by cities, and cities are slower. I came back? The confusion did not embarrass me. Confusion should be a registered citizen in every room where truth applies for residency. Twice a year, she said. You called it house-sitting. We called it feeding the shelves. She allowed herself the smallest smile, the kind one raises on a stick to test the wind. Once you brought someone who loved you poorly, and we made him leave because the house is a jealous animal. Forgive us that, or don't. I skimmed the graphite with my fingertip and felt the familiar denial of smoothness, the way pencil always refuses to be truly flat. Under one flap, the tamarind mural breathed. Under another, a small painting of a man's back leaving a room, attention compressed into shoulders. Under a third, a school composition mine, practice cursive rehearsing the sentence, I will not speak for other people's objects without permission. You taught me ethics, I said, by building a room to store other people's unspoken. Ethics are just fences we weep over, she said. We are busy people. We needed something practical. We counted until counting became its own weather. In my notebook I wrote, the room insists on keeping time like a metronome, that is sorry for the song it interrupts. On the wall, in my own former hand, I had written, if I rename fear as humidity, the room accepts it and stops adding doors. My aunt read that and placed her palm to the wall as if checking a fever in a child who refused to admit illness. The wall cooled. Cooling is a language, too. At noon, the lane cooked itself. The house took off some of its politeness, and I loved it for this. In the kitchen, my aunt made rice with the efficiency women practice when they have already had 5 conversations with death today. We ate with the reverence hunger demands because it is an old religion and it works. She did not ask me about my clinic, where I had given other people's silences a way to earn salaries. I did not ask her about the funeral. Some next-of-kin conversations require rooms we hadn't counted yet. After we ate, she washed her bowl and I watched her hands, the square, practical fingers, the blunt nails. Her hands could have been my hands if I had been born into her choices. She dried the bowl and then did a thing I had not expected. She set the dry bowl on the windowsill next to the bowl of dog food turned to stone. She took the rabbit from the bag and set it in the bowl as if to teach it to float. Now we go upstairs, she said. The inventory of closets always waits until after lunch. It makes a day behave. The closet greeted us like a pet that solves its loyalty by choosing the house over the people. Coats parted in the practice choreography of soft theater. The little door opened without the performance of keys, as if it had already seen me. The bulb offered itself. The trunk with my carved name allowed itself to be touched. We removed nothing. We looked. Looking is a category that deserves prayer. This is the museum of the nouns we could not bear to put in sentences, my aunt said. We kept it to shame ourselves and to forgive the child who carved. We were hoping we would grow up before we had to use any of it. Use it? I asked, because the day had already resigned itself to accuracy. We will take the rabbit and the red thread and the composition book to the room, she said. We will put them on the table. We will ask the room to exhale. We will tie the thread from the metronome to the leg of the chair, so that if the metronome tries to run, we will notice. Will it run? Apologies run, she said. Rhythm is their excuse. Back in the room, we arranged the objects. We did not add ceremony. Ceremony would have distracted the house by offering it theatrics when what we needed was grammar. My aunt tied the red thread to the foot of the metronome and to the chair leg. The thread made a level line that confirmed the slope of the floor without humiliating it. We placed the rabbit where it could hear. What now? I asked, ready to be told to fetch incense, salt, a photograph, a witness. Now, my aunt said, and she sat, and she did nothing, simple nothing, the kind practiced by women who have had to stand still in rooms while storms exhausted themselves into floors. I sat too. The metronome ticked. The thread held steady. The wall offered a shimmer, which is the body's word for acknowledgement. There is a piece of the wall we never opened, my aunt said after a time, because opening requires a person with the right jaw to stand in the room and accept that the wall keeps teeth. Your mother was brave, but she did not have your jaw. What will it show? I asked, already pleading with my chest to behave even as it remembered its other job, which is editing breath. The day we did the first inventory, she said, the day we asked the house to store the weather of a man, the day you chose to stay by, learning to leave. And dime lay fawned. I thought of the chalk word in the far box and understood a new cruelty in its 4 letters. Stay had been a spell that required a girl to rename leaving as residence. I felt a small heat in the throat that asks nothing but air. I placed my palm to my sternum and felt my ribs negotiate. I was still allowed to be held up. Where? I asked. It felt polite to allow geography to take responsibility for time. My auntie touched the penciled wall at a place I had not noticed, for its very domesticity, the sober depiction of a rice cooker. Beneath it, a faint rectangle, the paper paste thinner, the graphite's shine interrupted by something unwilling to be piano. Press here, she said, and I did. The rectangle resisted with the passive-aggressive courtesy of someone who knows you will ask twice. I pressed again, firmer. The flap lifted. Behind it, not paint, not pencil, not even paper. Cloth. A square of cloth glued to the wall. A housecloth old cotton, softened by obedience. On it, in neat red thread, the kind used to anchor the living to their names, someone had embroidered a picture of a tamarind tree and a woman and a baby and a key, and beneath it, letters, stay. It got into everything, I said. The thought did not accuse. It apologized for having arrived late to its own party. The cloth was your mother's, my aunt said. She believed embroidery was the calming form of lying. Her hand rested on the edge of the cloth as if to keep it from slipping into the year. Under this cloth is the one thing we did not count. I inhaled, the kind of breath you take when you are already busy negotiating with your future. She lifted the cloth from its glue with the careful confidence of someone teaching a child to remove a bandage that had become a law. Beneath, old paint, a hinge, a small door inside the wall. The house has a mouth, I said unnecessarily. Of course it does. My aunt's mouth did not agree to be amused. Ask, she said. Ask whom? And, the wall, she said. And when she did not qualify, I realized that all my degrees had taught me how to ask questions on paper, and my most ancient language had always been addressed to rooms. I placed my hand on the small door and allowed the skin of my palm to become something greedy for information. Please, I said, not to my aunt, not to my attempts at phrasing, but to the structure. Permit. The little door opened on a dark the size of a hand. Inside, a key identical to the one my aunt had given me last night, only smaller, as if the house had been practicing. A rolled piece of paper, a small bell, the kind that summons a teacher in schools where teachers are a compassionate form of authority and not a profession. On the paper, in my mother's sharp handwriting, each letter a reasonable soldier. To Linh, for when you have left properly and returned in a better verb, we will not ask your forgiveness because the house will draft if we do, and we cannot afford drafts in a city with this kind of heat. We will ask your permission. We built the room so you could keep listening without keeping the weather. We did it badly and well. If there is an ethics that fits into a house, it is this: permit. Permit yourself to name what happened without choosing to live inside the naming. Permit us our attempt without making a religion of it. Permit endings. Ring the bell once, and the room will exhale without cruelty. Ring it twice, and it will remember us. Ring it 3 times, and it will forget what it was built for and return to being a pantry for rice. Please do not turn the room into an altar. Altars eat daughters. Sparrow, your mother, and the one who refused to be a bird, your aunt. I held the paper and allowed my mouth to refuse to perform the expression people call closure. Closure pretends to be a door. It is often only a drawer you cannot open again. I chose a smaller word: consent. Once, I said aloud, to the room, to the house that requested verbs, to my own pulse, legitimizing itself against my ribs. My aunt nodded, solemn as a librarian, granting access to the forbidden stacks. I rang the bell. It was not an impressive sound. It did not make wind. It did not invite ancestors to come and litigate. It made the kind of sound that might convince a child to sit up straighter for 20 seconds and then forget. And yet, the room shifted. Not like an earthquake, but like a well-meaning person at a bad party deciding to leave early. The metronome stopped without being asked. The thread loosened its strictness. The pencil wall exhaled narration. The graphite lost its shine. The slope held. But its intention stopped accusing gravity. My aunt closed her eyes, perhaps to audit some interior metric. Count, she said softly. I counted the breath between metronome ticks that no longer happened. I counted drafts that had been accidents when the word sorry rubbed its own fur the wrong way and decided to stop shedding. I counted how many doors the room was pretending to make and found only the usual number of walls. I counted my heart as if it were an object that had accepted a job with benefits. I counted the photographs I would not take because the house had requested that we leave some living to the room's own narrative. Again? I asked, looking at the bell, which sat now in my palm like something that would not hurt anyone if it could help it. Twice, my aunt said, if you can bear remembering. I can, I said, and the sentence nearly refused my mouth, but I kept it. There are sentences that deserve to be stolen back from reluctance. I rang the bell twice. The room remembered. Not with theater. Remembering is rarely loud unless you have chosen the kind of life that encourages shouting. The remembering arrived with smells, the ghost of hair oil, the metallic taste of apology in a hot kitchen, a certain talc that corrupts the innocence of powder by insisting on witness. The penciled wall became legible in a new accent. Words I had written years ago decided they were writing me now. The tamarind on the mural bent into the room as if to shake hands with air. The rabbit in the bowl on the windowsill downstairs heard something and did not cry out. My mother sang, somewhere uncaught by microphones. Not a melody, but that old survival tune mothers hum when the dinner is late because mercy took too long. I remembered the room as we built it, my aunt's hands steadying shelves, my own small finger placing labels that said, shh, because I had not yet met syllables that could ask anyone to love me without being useful. My mother embroidered verbs in red thread on squares of cloth because she believed neatness could charm a weather system into skipping a house it did not own. We painted graphite over cloth because we believed memory should not be laundered, even if it stains. We made a library because we had books and not swords. A draft rose and then settled. A bird remembering its nest had been an art project. In the far distance, which is to say in the corner of the room where the slope argues with its obligations, a child stood, sandals, chalk between fingers like a cigarette. She looked at me and did not smile because smiling is a dress some truths refuse to wear. Inventory complete? She asked. Not yet, I said, but enough to pass the class. The house wants a new word for the far box, she said, and this time I saw that her mouth had my aunt's impatience, slightly more than my mother's tenderness, and exactly my habit of pretending to be smaller than the room demanded. SPARROW has served, stay has finished its shift. What word? I'm a child, she said with the honest disdain of accurate station. You're the one with a degree. My aunt looked at me. The look agreed to be blessing and boundary. 3 times, she said for formality, but her eyes had already turned toward the door with that busy woman's attention that says, I trust you to close this by yourself, because I will always have more work to do than there are bells in the house. What happens if I ring it 3 times? I asked. For the purpose of recording literature. The room becomes a pantry, she said. Rice is a quiet that will not hurt you. You can count rice. Rice consents to being counted. If there is a future that requires a pantry more than a confession booth, choose it. And if I don't, the house grows new rooms, she said. And daughters learn new dress codes for trauma. He ate. My aunt left without requiring me to translate her departure into theater. The child waited without fidgeting, a disrespectful kindness. The rabbit sat in its bowl, considering flotation. I looked at the bell, considered the verbs I had been taught to worship, and behaved like a woman who knows the difference between religion and a good habit. I rang the bell the 3rd time. In some stories, this would be the part where light enacts itself, where stale words gallop from shelves like horses exiting a painting, where rooms crack open like eggs and release new species of breakfast. In this story, the room did what it had been promised. It took off its vestments and put on an apron. The shelves did not empty. They agreed to stop manufacturing duplicates. The penciled wall became merely pencil. The slope quit its performance and accepted gravity's modesty. The metronome did not resume. The thread disobliged itself of the chair leg and lay on the table like a vein that had chosen to be merely string. The child stepped off the far corner and became a girl without job description. What does it say now? She asked, pointing with her chalk finger toward the wall that the wall had never had, the one outside that kept trying to be a hopscotch court that domesticated labyrinths. I haven't looked, I said. We walked to the lane. The pavement received us with the patience of grandparents. The chalk pattern had been reauthored. The boxes still spiraled, because some geometries have the right to recur. In the far square, not SPARROW, not stay. 4 letters, neither imperative nor plea. Open. I did not feel the worst sort of grandeur. The city laughed in its ordinary way, a mechanic dropping a wrench and swearing, a vendor singing a price and meaning it, a child convinced that dust is a form of magic because it becomes visible when light admits it. I had a house and a bell and 2 women who had not known how to avoid building a complicated love around a girl who listened too well. I had a pantry. I had a room that had agreed to be a pantry. Inside, the kitchen felt the way kitchens feel when they have been reprieved from metaphor. My aunt had left on the counter a small bag of rice and the blue enamel pot my mother had loved because it understood obligation. The apology seam looked like a well-fitted piece of carpenter's work. The draft had retired. Open, the chalk had said. Not stay, not leave. The frightening thing about open is that it does not promise to keep you. I carried the brown notebook to the table and, in a neat hand mine, now that mimicry had agreed to be ancestry instead of theft, I wrote, Day 2. The house has been taught permit. The room has been retired to pantry. The metronome has been thanked for service and given an unpaid sabbatical. Inventory complete in the sense that enough has been counted to ask time to stop auditioning for the part of God. New rule. The house is allowed nouns without verbs after sunset. New verb for the far box. Open. I closed the notebook, which is the cheapest form of ceremony and the one least likely to become a cult. There were calls to make. If I wanted the clinic to continue to have a me, there were photographs to avoid taking. There was a rabbit to assign a shelf that did not elevate it to deity, but did not demote it to trash. There was rice. There was a city that had accepted me as a citizen again without requiring an oath. There were neighbors humming abuse at karaoke machines and calling it music because sometimes we have to practice kindness for our futures. Evening bent in, not menacing, merely honest. I untied the red thread from the table leg and tied it to my wrist with a knot I could loose with my teeth. I placed the small bell in the cupboard next to the good tea we never used, and then decided to use the good tea because some props are still needed, but for better theater. The portrait watched from her original height and looked less judgmental, or perhaps my jaw had stopped waiting for sentence. On the windowsill, the rabbit did not need to learn to float today. That felt like the sort of small, ordinary sentence that is enough to carry a person upright from the kitchen to the bed and back. The temple bell across the lanes made the evening remember itself. I stood in the doorway and watched the chalk court gather dusk, its word without italics, a word that did not claim me. The child's sandals scuffed. She appeared, not magician-like, only like a neighbor late to dinner. You didn't ask me my name, she observed, as small people do when they have been invisible in precisely the way that raises ethical questions later. Sparrow, I said, testing both of us. She shook her head, solemn with the luxury of accuracy. House, she said, tapping her small chest with the chalk. Yours. She pointed at the doorframe. When you go, leave it open if you mean to return. Shut it if you want to teach the house good boundaries. This was the part in other stories where I would declare a large truth aloud for the sake of syntax and courage. Instead, I asked a smaller, truer question. Will you be all right? I said. It was not clear to which of us it applied. She shrugged the shrug we all wear when adulthood hands us a set of keys and a tongue with too much history. If you count sometimes, she said, and if you permit sometimes, and if you stop making nouns do the work of verbs. I can manage two sometimes, I said, but the third will resent me. She grinned, and I recognized my mother's mouth performing joy without apology. Open, she said, pointing to the far square, and now it did look like a hopscotch a body could play if it did not cheat. When she left, she did not go down the lane. She stepped into the seam of the wall like someone whose passport is time, and I did not chase her. The house had learned I was not a room. I had learned rooms are not gods, only rooms. Night arranged itself politely. I made rice in the blue enamel pot and listened to the soft arithmetic of it coming to a boil and creeping down from that brief arrogance to something consistent, edible, enough. I set a bowl on the sill for the rabbit because caring for inanimate witnesses is my family's way of refusing harm. I took the portrait down a few inches so we could meet each other correctly. Before sleep, I went to the pantry and stood there, not as a penitent and not as a priest. I rang the bell once, without reason. The room did not exhale anything I couldn't bear. It accepted its job. I accepted mine. Upstairs, I turned the metronome to face the wall and left it unwound. The city did not applaud. The city is not a theater. It is merely a house with complicated walls. I lay down. The ceiling had learned from the day, and the corners agreed to stop auditioning for the role of verdict. Through the shutters, a draft that was not an apology entered and left with the courtesy of a neighbor who knows which hours are for discord and which are for mercy. The last thing I heard before sleep was the smallest bell, not the one in the pantry, but the one in my chest that rings for sentences when they have found the right tense. It did not ask me to stay. It did not ask me to leave. It did not ask. It told me the story knew how to walk to the door and to open it. Then it rang itself into quiet, a quiet earned, not enforced. In the morning, the chalk word would still be there. In the morning, my jaw would still be mine, and the house would not ask to wear it. In the morning, there would be rice, tea, and the small work of counting kindnesses as if they could be inventory, as if they wanted to be. For now, the door was neither shut nor ajar. It was open, the kind of open that accepts a life passing through without turning itself into fate. The house slept the way houses do when they have laid down their verbs and agreed to be nouns. And I slept, and the city kept time that belonged to no metronome,